Good day to you, ladies and gentlemen. I must start with a word of apology. I am terribly sorry for not being present there physically. I had made arrangements, changed my plans in such a way that I would be spending the whole day with you. Unfortunately, I've been traveling extensively, and during the course of a trip to Southeast Asia, I apparently picked up a viral, and that has given me fever. I'm much better now. I've been taking medication, but with some of these viruses, medication doesn't really help very much. And the doctor has advised me not to travel because I still have temperature, and he felt that travel overseas would not be desirable. So once again, my deepest apologies to you. I think this entire day is extremely important, and I know the numbers of distinguished people who would be present during the course of the day. We are more or less at a stage where we have to take some very deliberate decisions on how to deal with climate change. And I really don't want to highlight the problems associated with climate change and the impacts, but essentially highlight the need for taking action. The time has come when we need to define what needs to be done. As chairman of the IPCC, I am not in a position to prescribe what needs to be done. I only want to present to you the science that we have brought out in the 3 working group reports which are part of the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. In the first working group 1 report, I want to mention to you that we clearly identified the fact that most of the warming that has taken place since the middle of the last century is extremely likely to have been caused by an increase in human-induced or anthropogenic concentration of greenhouse gases. And when we use the term extremely likely, we are assigning a probability of over 95%. So you can absorb the fact that today there is really no place at all for doubt or uncertainty on the responsibility that we as human society have for having caused warming. I also want to mention the fact that we clearly found that in the last 3 decades, beginning 1983, ending in 2012, each successive decade has been warmer than the previous one. And this particular 30-year period is likely to have been the warmest 30-year period over a period of 1400 years. I'm mentioning this only to say that human actions are now having an impact on the climate of this planet at a rate which is quite unprecedented. There are also very serious impacts of climate change. These are taking place in the form of sea level rise, with melting of all the bodies of ice, thermal expansion of the ocean, ocean acidification. 30% of all the CO2 emitted since the beginning of industrialization has gone into the oceans, which is causing ocean acidification. And frankly, that has major implications for coral reefs and all forms of marine life. Climate change is also leading to migration of species, so fish stocks which existed in a particular part of the planet will now move elsewhere because of changes in the climate. There are changes taking place in rainfall patterns, on the impacts on agriculture and agricultural yields, and on human health. So all of this put together, and particularly looking at some of the projections for the future, gives us a basis for taking action in 2 sets of ways. One is through adapting to the impacts of climate change, because irrespective of what we do to limit emissions of greenhouse gases, there will be continuing impacts of climate change for several decades. And therefore, we have no choice but to adapt to them. Now, there's a whole range of adaptation options that we can take in hand, but most of these will require building capacities, building institutions at the local level, setting up low regrets or low cost measures like early warning systems and so on. We have also brought out the fact that beyond a certain point, we may be crossing thresholds or reaching tipping points where adaptation options might narrow very rapidly, and adapting to the more serious impacts of climate change which would occur will become extremely challenging. So therefore, what we really need is a strategy by which we adapt as well as mitigate. Now, of course, adaptation measures are largely going to be implemented at the local level, even though resources, know-how, and other inputs may be provided on a global basis. But where mitigation is concerned, that has to be a global action, because we are dealing with gases that mix freely, and therefore the emissions have to be reduced to reduce the global concentration of greenhouse gases. Now here, may I say, we have clearly identified a whole lot of mitigation options, and these are feasible. If we want to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius, as has been set, let's say in Cancun and subsequent conferences of the parties, then what we have pointed out is that there would be actions required, for instance, to treble or quadruple the amount of low carbon or zero carbon energy supply, let's say through the provision of renewable energy technologies. We have also identified agriculture, forestry and land use as a major area where interventions and changes will be required. And this particular group of sources of emissions accounts for about 24% of total emissions. So if we want to stabilize the climate of this planet and keep temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius, then this is one particular sector which will have to be addressed. Now, all of this, fortunately, is economically attractive. Why? Because the cost of mitigation actions is really very modest. We have estimated that for the pathway by which we can bring temperature increase to be limited to 2 degrees Celsius, we would be imposing a median value in terms of loss of consumption of only 1.7% in 2030. In 2050 it will be a little higher, by 2100 it will be somewhat higher. But if you look at the benefits of avoiding some of the worst impacts of climate change, then clearly this is not at all a high price to pay. What makes it even more attractive is the fact that there are huge co-benefits with mitigation measures. And what are these co-benefits? Well, firstly, higher levels of energy security, lower levels of environmental pollution at the local level, protection of ecosystems, and a multiplicity of other benefits from creating a much cleaner and a much more sustainable future for human society. And finally, let me say that there are also risks associated with some of the impacts of climate change that are directly a threat to human life and property. And these are in the nature of extreme events. We have brought out a special report on extreme events and disasters about 3 years ago, and in that we clearly identified that heat waves and extreme precipitation events in particular are on the increase in frequency and intensity. In the case of heat waves, for instance, we have found that in most regions, those heat waves which currently take place once in 20 years will occur by the end of the century once in 2 years, unless we mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases adequately and on a timely basis. So, looking at all these facts, my submission to you, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, is that we now have to chart out a path of action which would involve adaptation measures, which would involve on a global basis adequate mitigation measures. And we can do it. And if we delay things, if we don't do enough in a reasonable period of time, then the costs will increase and the impacts of climate change will become far more serious. What is also particularly relevant is the fact that some parts of the globe, some communities are going to be far more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And some of these are some of the poorest people on this planet. But may I also emphasize that climate change will leave no part of this world untouched in terms of impacts. we've also found that in those societies where there are large differences between rich and poor, climate change can lead to an expansion of pockets of poverty. So we are all in this together, and we therefore have to get together and work out a plan of action, as I'm sure all of you ladies and gentlemen will be doing during the course of the day. My only regret is that I'm not there with you, but I wish you all the best, and I'm sure you'll have a wonderful set of discussions and deliberations on the basis of which society will emerge far better informed and far better equipped to take care of this challenge of climate change which we are facing. Thank you very much, and once again my deepest apologies in not being able to join you. Thank you.